So the next session is titled Regulation of Contraceptives. My name is Linda Rhodes. I've been on the board of ACC&D for many, many years. And this is a topic near and dear to my heart because I am by profession and training a drug developer, so I have done a lot of work on regulatory issues. And I think we have the perfect person to talk about this subject. I'm really pleased to introduce Dr. David Petrick, who has been a friend and colleague of mine for many, many years. I first met David when he was the worldwide head of regulatory affairs at Shearing Plow Animal Health, back when there was a Shearing Plow Animal Health. And that company got gobbled up by Merck. And David and I lived in New Jersey at the time, and I was teaching a course at Rutgers in the animal science department called Animal Pharmaceuticals. And I was always looking for good guest speakers, and I invited David to come as a guest speaker. And at the time, I was a consultant. I had left Big Pharma to work on my own. And he kind of sidled up to me and winked at me and said, "Could I talk to you about consulting?" Because Shearing Plow was going through a transition, and I encouraged him. I thought he would make a fantastic consultant, and since then, he has been a world-renowned consultant for many, many companies who are trying to bring new products to market. So he has his own business called Delta Consortium Regulatory Consulting, and he's done work on approving drugs, getting drugs approved both in the U.S. and worldwide. He's also supported ACC&D as a member of our scientific advisory board for more than 14 years. So he bases his understanding of regulation of animal health products on the law because in addition to being a veterinarian, and he is a VMD, which many of you might know means, like me, he graduated from University of Pennsylvania, a very medical doctor. And he also has a JD in regulatory affairs. And so he is a lawyer, attorney by training. But he also has a lot of expertise in approaching regulatory agencies and understanding how they think from their point of view. And that is a really critical way to help facilitate moving through the regulatory minefield. He's going to give us a high-level overview of the regulation of animal health products, and that's going to help us ground ourselves in the type and extent of data required to bring a new contraceptive or sterilant to regulatory approval. So with that, I'll turn it over to David, and thank you very much for joining us, David.
Well, that was a lovely introduction, and I have to thank Linda and also Kathy Moldave, who's here as well, because both of them were very instrumental in me making my decision to get out of pharma, to start being a consultant on my own. It seemed like a good time to do it. I had just gotten my law degree, and as she said, Shearing Plow was going through some changes, so it was a good time for me to break out, I guess you could say. So what we're going to talk about today, I have veterinary drug development, regulation of sterilants and contraceptives. And the outline that we're going to follow, as you can see here, I feel, well, there's a quote that I use when I provide this class to people. We do a class usually annually in London. And one of the quotes I use from that, I'm a big believer in quotes, and there's a quote from Benjamin Franklin that says, what matters knowing the name if not the nature of something? So what we're going to do today, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of drug regulation. I'm going to explain to you where it comes from. And the reason I think that's important is that's one way for you to get a better understanding of why the regulators handle things the way they handle them. And hopefully by going through this history, it'll make more sense to you as we then work through the rest of the product, or rest of the presentation. We're going to talk about other U.S. agencies that regulate animal health products. We'll touch on those a little bit. I'm going to talk to you then about U.S. submission technical sections. That is a manner that a sponsor uses in supplying the data to CVM, the Center for Vet Medicine, that they use to get an approval for a new animal drug. We're going to talk a little bit about U.S. and the EU, and I'll show you and mention the EU format of the submission versus the U.S. format of the submission, and you're going to see that the data requirements, while very much the same, the formatting of those requirements can be a bit different. So we'll talk about that. And then the last sections I have here is really getting into the nitty-gritty about what you file as a sponsor of a new animal drug in chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. That's how you make the product, target animal safety, efficacy, environmental safety, and then we will summarize things at the end of the talk before we wrap up. Do know that if you do want to ask questions, if I say something that you just can't quite get your head around, please stop me. Just come up to the microphone and ask your question, and I'll do my best to answer it. And I'm also going to try and make sure that I leave time at the end of the presentation so I can answer any questions from the floor at that point. So let's move on then. And as Linda said, I am a lawyer, so I'll preclude a little bit of that with my bias toward relying on these laws and the way things work in the U.S. It's just easier for me. I'm not really that much of a scientist like the rest of you. I don't get down into the nitty-gritty, the molecular level of things. I'm more on this esoteric law part. And maybe the worst part of it for you is that we're sitting here ready for you to go get a drink, and you're still listening to me. So we're going to try and make this as useful for you as possible. Well, if we look at the history in the U.S., it goes back to the start of the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Okay? Now, this is when Congress, in its infinite wisdom, decided that a product could not be sold if it was labeled in a false and misleading way. Okay, now this is in the era when you had all the secret ingredients and Dr. Brown's magic elixir, and people didn't know what was in different products. Well, there were problems with that. Congress, and it was Teddy Roosevelt's time, you had this whole era of the muckrakers and journalists pointing out these horrible conditions in certain areas. Well, the United States decided, the Congress decided they would pass what was called the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Now, the way things work in the U.S., as you're all probably aware, the final say on any law is going to be the Supreme Court. So if a law gets challenged, or what does the law eventually really mean, it goes to the Supreme Court. Now, the seminal case in this particular area was United States versus Johnson, and this was the decision that was passed down in 1911. It was written, the opinion was written by Oliver Wendell Holmes, one of the most respected jurists in U.S. jurisprudence history. And what Holmes said in his opinion, and was the opinion of the court, that the act addressed ingredients only under false and misleading sections. And what they said was efficacy is a matter of opinion of the medical community. Okay? And the quote that I took here was, but a very different and unlikely step to make them answerable to mistaken praise. Okay? So, you could package sugar water and say if you thought it was going to treat cancer, if you had data to show that, or you truly believed that, that was okay, because efficacy was a matter of the scientific community. And something that is false only in its commendatory and prophetic aspect, meaning that it's false because you're claiming it can do something that it can't, is not within the act. Okay, so what the Supreme Court was basically saying, the only thing the Pure Food and Drug Act addressed was false and misleading labeling. Okay, now keep that in mind, because we're going to come back to that. False and misleading labeling is outlawed by the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906. Okay, so it was a test that established this limited intent of Congress from the 1906 Act. Well, now we move ahead. And we'll move all the way up to 1938. And this is where we get the law that we're still working under today. This is the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938. This is what people call the Act, or the FD&C Act, if you hear people refer to it as that. It's the core law, and what you would refer to if you were, speaking to a group of lawyers, you would say the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 as amended, because there have been many amendments passed on it over the years. Now, what it did in 1938, it provided authority to FDA to require safety data prior to marketing. Okay, now this was a big change. Prior to this time, there was no agency that required the owner or the sponsor to provide data on any aspect of the product up until this 1938 Act. And then they said you're going to have to show safety. The trigger for this was elixir of sulfanilamide. There were 107 deaths associated with this. Sulfanilamide, an antibiotic-type product, a sulfa drug. And the reason it caused 107 deaths is someone had the brilliant idea that we need to put something in there to sweeten up the medicine. So they used ethylene glycol. Thank you very much. Ethylene glycol, and if you're veterinarians in the group, you know what it does to cats and dogs when they lap up the antifreeze in people's cars as the winter comes around. So anyway, Congress acted on that and passed it and said now there's a clear congressional intent for the regulation of drugs to protect the public interest. So this is the first time you had safety added as a component. So now a product had to be shown to be safe by the sponsor, and they could only label it in a way that wasn't false and misleading. All right, so now we've got two components that we're looking at. We'll move ahead to 1962. What you had in 1962, you had all the thalidomide experience and the problems with Europe that approved thalidomide for use in pregnant women to handle their morning sickness. FDA never approved the product for that use, and because you had this reviewer at FDA that refused to accept thalidomide as an approved product, Congress decided, oh, well, that's too close, that's too risky, so we've got to change it, we're going to require greater safety. But what they also did in 1962 is they decided it was appropriate for a sponsor to provide data on the effectiveness of the product. Okay? So now what you had, product could not be false and misleading in its labeling, had to be shown to be safe, and it had to be shown to be effective. Okay? So this is where, if you talk to people like me you're talking about drug regulation and what is it, how does it work, you say, well, you got to show the product safe and effective, and it can be made in a quality manner, and you have to only advertise it in accordance with the label. So that's really what you're looking at. And it wasn't until 1962, now some of you, that probably seems like eons ago. For some of us my age, it doesn't seem that long ago. But 1962, when these Kefauver-Harris drug amendments came into effect, that you actually had these new standards being set up. I show you the 1968 animal drug amendments here. It put all the animal drug provisions in one spot. Now, it's not to make you think that animal drugs weren't regulated prior to 1968, because even the 1938 Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act included drugs that were to be used by animals or man or other animals. So animal drugs have been there from the very beginning. Now, we're going to talk briefly now about other regulatory agencies in the U.S., and it has an impact on what you've seen with some of the products in the past and where some people might think they could take a product in the future, especially for a contraceptive or a sterilant. The Animal Plant and Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, and the Center for Veterinary Biologics, CVB, of the USDA. Now, USDA regulates under the Virus Serum Toxin Act of 1913. Okay, so came up 7 years later than the Pure Food and Drug Act, but many years before the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938. Now, Section 902C of the FD&C Act states, nothing contained in the Act shall be construed as in any way affecting, modifying, repealing, or superseding the provisions of the Virus Serum Toxin Act and analogous product provisions of 37 Stat 832, 833, and that's the the U.S. statute that relates to the Virus Serum Toxin Act. So animal biologics are the purview of the Center for Veterinary Biologics of USDA. This is not the case with human biologics. In human medicine, drugs used in humans are regulated by CDER, the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. Human biologics are regulated by the Center for Biologic CBER Evaluation and Research, whereas veterinary drugs are regulated at USDA, totally different agency entirely, not under the Department of Health and Human Services, but under the Department of Agriculture. So there's this big divergence there. Now, FDA says that animal biologics are really drugs, which they are. If you look at the definition of what a drug is, animal biologics are truly drugs. And it's because of that definition of what a drug is that human biologics are regulated by CBER. But they're regulated by the Virus Serum Toxin Act, and therefore they're under USDA. There is a memorandum of understanding that defines jurisdiction on some products that are in this nebulous area, and it's become more and more nebulous as science has changed, and you have more products now in the biologic area, and how do they impact, and whether they're an antiviral product or if it's being delivered by biotechnology, and where does that product actually fit. So there is a standing committee with USDA and FDA that defines where these products are going to go. But you need to realize that CVB regulates on a disease basis. Okay, so if you've got a product that's going to treat distemper or going to treat rabies or be a vaccine for those kinds of conditions, you're fine. USDA welcomes those with open arms. But USDA has said, and FDA has confirmed this, that pregnancy is not a disease. Okay? So what that tells you is that you can't go to USDA with either a sterilant or a contraceptive because they're still going to send you to FDA because they're going to say, well, it's a new animal drug under the meaning of the Act. And what we at USDA feel is our view or our jurisdiction under the Virus Serum Toxin Act. Okay, so that's not to explode a myth, but it all falls back to USDA. Now, there is one other agency we can talk to, and that's the Environmental Protection Agency, or the EPA. They regulate under two acts of Congress, one called the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA. You may have heard of that one. And then there's also Toxic Substances Control Act, or TSCA, which came along many years later in 1976. So EPA regulates FIFRA and TSCA. Pretty much what they're concerned about, by and large, is regulation of crop protection chemicals. So they would be herbicides, insecticides, different products that are to be used on crop products. They do regulate products for animals if you are treating pests. So, for example, topical flea medications, that's probably one of the biggest products that I can think of that you know about. Fipronil, Frontline from Marielle, one of the biggest animal health products ever, topically applied, registered by EPA because it was not systemically active, and it you were treating the pests, meaning the flea and the ticks, on the dogs and the cats. All right, so EPA is going to regulate products that treat pests. Now, as I said here, there's dual registration carried late into the 70s for some products that were both regulated by EPA and FDA, but that's a thing of the past. There's another one of these memorandum of understanding between EPA and FDA that's set up. They will get together and decide who's going to regulate what. Now, EPA has provided some regulation for and we heard about the one product that was mentioned here today about sterilizing the white-tailed deer and the wild donkeys and wild horses. EPA does grant those registrations, but recognize they're granted as registrations for the treatment of pests. And in this indication, they're talking about the white-tailed deer as a pest. They're talking about the wild horses as being pests in some environment. That's how EPA takes jurisdiction for those products. Okay, I think it would be a hard step, I think, for most of us here to think of either feral cats or dogs in the wild as being pests that we'd want to think of as a pesticide product. And recognize also that this isn't a easy path forward either. When you have a pesticide product that goes through, there's an awful lot of toxicology that goes into this. There's an awful lot of background science. There's a little bit less as far as efficacy is concerned, but by and large, it's still a major, costly, time-consuming product to get a pesticide product approved. Likewise with a vaccine. It's not like it's a shortcut or an incredibly easy agency. It's just a different agency. So in my career, I've dealt with all three agencies, and it's just one of those things. It's three agencies in the U.S. that we have to deal with, and it depends where your product fits. So if we look at, now we're talking about a new animal drug. And one of the things I always talk to the class about is, well, what is a new animal drug? And it's really whatever the Act says it is. So it's a product that's going to affect, it's going to cure, mitigate, or treat a disease, or it's going to affect the structure or function of the animal or man. Okay? So here we're talking about a product that's going to affect structure and function of the animal it's being administered to as a contraceptive. So what you do, when Linda mentioned being in drug development, and she and I came from the same basis on that. I was in drug development most of my career. Got there not that long after vet school, and I'm not going to tell you when I graduated from vet school because it'll just make me appear too old. But anyway, so when you're doing drug development, what you look at is what's the molecule going to do? You look at maybe the class, the structure, the amount of administration you're looking for, and then also the species. Then you're going to ask yourself, can the molecule be used safely? Now, that's not only safe in the target species, but also those in contact with the molecule. Because if this is a brand new molecule, or if it's something brand new to chemistry or a modification of existing product, you have to be sure that the people working on it are going to be safe when they're handling the molecule as well. You then, at least in my opinion, the next thing you have to do is look at the initial draft label. And the reason I say that that's one of the most critical things you have to look at first is if you remember what happened in 1906, Pure Food and Drug Act said a product can't be false and misleading in its labeling. All right? So you've got to touch base with that label first, because the label is what's really going to guide the process, and it's also going to outline what you need to do to gain approval for your product. Now, we're going to go through this in general. I'm going to show you what the technical sections are in the U.S. That's where I'm going to base most of this discussion, because it just falls out easier that way. But you're basically looking at how you're going to show that the product's safe, effective, can be made in a quality way, and that then will be used in accordance with its labeling. Okay, so don't underestimate the importance of the label. Very critical for getting something done. What I'm going to show you here now, this is a guidance for Industry 132, and it was talked about administrative applications in the phased review process. This has been in effect for 20 years anyway, with this phased review system that CVM has followed. This guidance wasn't finalized. I believe it was finalized only in 2015, so it took them a long time to get their act together to actually pull this all in place. But what this this idea of an administrative review process came out from actually the FDA director and his associate director, who were looking at ways of responding to industry saying, well, it's taking too long to get these products approved. We think there's a drug lag between Europe and the US, and we're not happy with this. So what the director and his associate came up with, well, it would probably be helpful to industry if each of their major sections that we deal with could be handled as a separate entity within the different review divisions with CVM. Now, you may know, or you may have heard on human drug development, they have drug phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4. But that really defines where they are in this linear continuum of getting finally to the market. What the phased review system does for CVM is when you have chemistry, manufacturing, and controls, when you have that technical section complete, you submit that to the Division of Manufacturing Technologies, and they start their review. And their 180-day review time starts. So likewise, when you have your effectiveness complete, you can submit that to the main review group who's going to take a look at target animal effectiveness. Likewise with target animal safety. It doesn't cover us here because we're not looking at food animals, but if it was a food animal product that you were developing, you would have to deal with human food safety. You also have to assess the environmental impact of the use of your product. You will file for them the final labeling and really all other information and your freedom of information summary that you provide to FDA is all done as these other sections are completed. So you're basically looking the top 5 or what I'd call the data-rich sections where you're going to have to provide a lot of information to them and get that in and get CVM to approve those for you to be able to get your new animal drug approved. Now this slide, I hope you can see it well enough, but this sort of looks at the EU format for their system. The EU divides the data set into 4 distinct parts. Part 1 is really an administrative section where you list the sponsor or the holder of what's going to be the drug approval. You will provide what they call in Europe the DACs, or the detailed and critical summaries of experts that the sponsor employs to take a look at their various sections. It also has the SPC, the specific product characteristics set of information that the sponsor provides that's part of the approval in the EU. So that's mostly administrative. Part 2 is literally the same kind of information that you need for chemistry, manufacturing, controls as you do in the US. So that's part 2. Part 3 talks about human food safety and really talks about the environmental section here. It talks about the safety of the toxicology will be in this part, talking about the residues, the metabolism of the product in a food animal. And part 4 will then be safety and effectiveness to the target animal. Okay, so you'll have all these sections that'll go into the European submission. Much of the data are going to be the same. The format is different. The other aspect that's different is Europe does not allow you to submit anything in a technical section. You do not have phased review. Everything has to go in all at once. The other big difference between Europe and the US, CVM tends to be very much a hands-on agency. You can, if you choose to, have multiple pre-submission conferences, that's defined in one of the regulations, where you go in as a sponsor and you have a lot of face-to-face conversations with CVM. You also talk to them about your plan of development, what studies you're proposing to do, and they will also then review and concur on protocols for your pivotal studies. So they will help you on CMC, they will help you on efficacy, they will help you on safety. All of that they will review and concur on protocol design before you run the study. That is their preference for you to do. It's not a requirement of a sponsor to submit these protocols for review and concurrence, but pretty much every sponsor does. They find that it's useful to gain CVM's concurrence rather than to submit data when you spent maybe $500,000 running a clinical study in the field to prove efficacy and have a CVM say to you, well, we don't think that was the right parameter to look at. So that can be money wasted away, time wasted away, and you don't want to go there. So when you have that opportunity, most sponsors agree that it's a useful thing to do and have that conversation with CVM. If we then look at the U.S. technical sections like I've done here, you can see where the EU dossier sort of slides in to those various technical sections. It's sort of a companion chart to the one just before. I am told that the slides are available for you to look at. So if any of these things are of use to you, please feel free to take a look. You'll also have my email address if you come up with questions later. I always try and tell people when I'm doing a presentation like this, if it's me, I always think of something afterward and wish I had thought of it during the presentation. But if you do come up with something, please send me an email. I'll be happy to answer you. Again, looking at the European approach here, the regulating group in Europe is the European Medicine Agency, and the technical component of the European Medicine Agency for veterinary products is the Committee for Veterinary Medicinal Products. So in the U.S., we have new animal drugs, okay? In the EU, you have veterinary medicinal products. Name, difference, but pretty much the same data set that's going to be used in each. Now there's all the EU member states, you need to realize, will apply the same standards, and they will apply the same scientific standards. So if you go for an approval, say just in Spain, Spain is still going to evaluate all those parts of the dossier that you saw, all those 4 parts, and they're going to look at the same types of studies to get an approval just in Spain as you would as if you were going for something under mutual recognition or the decentralized procedure or the central procedure. Now, the 2 extremes are national, where you would get 1 application, 1 approval, and you can only sell it in that country. Once you have that 1 approval, then you could take that through mutual recognition, where you ask other member states to follow what the first member state did and approve the product. It's a shorter process, but you still provide all the data to the member states that you want to go to. There's also called a decentralized procedure, which is sort of a blend of the 2, where you go to 1 member state and say, I'd like you to approve this or act as my rapporteur to get the product approved throughout the rest of the member states. And you do it all at the same time, though. So you'll go to these other member states that you want while you're having your first approval in that by that first national authority. The last approval is central, and it's pretty much what it says. This, when you make the application to the European Medicine Agency itself, there are limitations on the types of products that can go centrally. There are some restrictions that require a product. Any biotech product, for example, has to go through the central procedure. But central is actually probably the most favorite for a multinational country, because at the end of that process, you're going to have approval in all of the member states. So you get an approval across the board if you do something centrally, where the others, you're picking and choosing the member states that you want. Now, you would think at that point that most of the approvals are going to be central, but actually far and away, most of the approvals are still national approvals. And I think that's primarily based on the fact that you still have a lot of national drug companies throughout the EU in the different member states that are only looking, they really aren't marketing their products outside their own country. So that's why you still have such a large number. As I said, the data requirements are very similar, and you can really run global programs of development. You're looking at safety, efficacy, quality as the standards that the EU is going to apply, just like the US. So if we look a little bit more at these various technical sections now, we're going to go through these fairly quickly. Won't be any quiz before the drinks or anything like that, so you don't need to worry, but I'm just trying to give you a flavor of what you go through for any drug product, and we're going to stop along the way on these various technical sections and talk a bit about what might be some of the pitfalls that might be a little unique for a sterilant or a contraceptive. So chemistry and manufacturing, you're really looking at two prime things here: the components and composition, and the manufacturing methods, facilities, and controls. And components and composition is really what's the formula. So you're going to tell them what's in the product, and you're going to tell them how you put that product together, what's the master formula for creating the product. So this section isn't really big, but it defines what the master formula is going to be. This is your final product. The importance of the components and composition is all of your testing, all your pivotal testing has to be done with the final formulation. There are exceptions to that where you can do bridging studies, but I will tell you, having been there in drug development, that's not a place you want to go. Decide on the final formulation and stick with it as you go through the development process. Now, the bigger part of this, manufacturing methods, facilities, control. This is a challenge for a lot of the newer products that are coming out, particularly, I would say, from certainly what Bob was talking about earlier, some of these novel approaches that are coming forward, whether they're vaccine-ish drugs, okay, or whether they're antibodies, they've still got to meet the requirements that CVM has set up under chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. I wouldn't worry too much about facilities or personnel, but you have to look at the specifications. You have to look at how you're going to assure identity, strength, quality, and purity from batch to batch. Because what CVM will emphasize to you as a sponsor is the reason they want to know about chemistry, manufacturing, and controls. They want to make sure that you can reproduce the product that you tested in the field to show them that that product is safe and that that product works, and that you can repeat making that product over and over again so that they can rely on their review of the data that you showed them to satisfy safety and effectiveness. So it's sort of a circular program, but it's an important aspect, and it can be a particular challenge for novel technologies coming into CVM. If they've not regulated these types of products before, the burden and the hurdle can be a lot higher. And sometimes part of that hurdle is educating the CVM reviewers so they understand what your technology is and understand how you're ensuring the strength and the identity and the quality of your product, down to things like your analytical controls and making sure that you've got everything that you need to show that you can produce these products in the continuous and typical manner. We look at target animal safety, and that's the regulation that identifies target animal safety, and it says that your submission has to contain full reports of adequate tests by all methods reasonably applicable to show whether or not the new animal drug is safe and effective for use as suggested by the proposed labeling. Point out to you again, reasonably applicable, big wide area there as to what that could be, how that could be defined. And also recognize the part that's effective for use, safe and effective as suggested in the proposed labeling. So again, I keep coming back to this, your label can't be false and misleading. There's definitive tests that are defined by the guidelines. GFI 185, GFI means Guidance for Industry 185. That's the way CVM refers to their guidelines that they have. And VICH, if you're not familiar with that, it's the Veterinary International Congress on Harmonization, and that's a group that has Europe in it, US in it, Japan, and I think there's some other member nations, but that's a consortium of scientists that have gotten together to come up with these guidelines. And GL43 is the VICH guideline that basically adopted what the US approach has been for many, many years, which is this basic design of 0.135x, the recommended dose for the product, administered for 3 times the duration. Again, final formulation, you do full clinical pathology on these animals, and you also do full histopathology. And they usually expect 4 animals per sex per group for this study. Very expensive, very time consuming. And now think of the issue for a sterilant or a contraceptive. If you're talking about a product that's expected to be working for a prolonged period of time, what is CVM going to ask you to do to monitor these animals for the safety study? Right now, they basically have a rule of thumb that says if you have a chronic administration, for example, an NSAID, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug to treat osteoarthritis in dogs, CVM will ask you to do a 6-month safety study at 135x the dose, and that 6 month is to mimic lifetime administration. So a challenge could be, especially if you're looking at a contraceptive that says it's going to last for a year or last for 6 months, and then you decide as a sponsor you want to be able to follow that up with another 6-month administration, that could make for a very long target animal safety study outside this general 6-month criteria. So that can be a real challenge dealing with target animal safety for a contraceptive or a sterilant type product. Effectiveness. Now, this, in quotes, is what CVM says. It says an application may be refused unless it includes substantial evidence of the effectiveness of the new animal drug as defined in that little squiggly thing is section, and that's of 21 Code of Federal Regulations, section 514.4. And then it gives you this long definition defining what substantial evidence is. But if you really look at it, there's still a lot of wide variety here of where it can actually go. It says 1 or more adequate and well-controlled studies, basis of which it could fairly and reasonably concluded by experts qualified by scientific training and experience. So again, there's a lot of leeway here, and it's also the kind of thing that makes me certainly want to avail myself of CVM's opportunity to review the protocol I'm providing to them, that I'm saying this is what's going to show my product is safe and effective to be used in accordance with the label that I'm proposing. Okay? So these types of definitions are what makes it very important to have that interaction with CVM all along the way. The last quote I have here is what's called the applicant's commitment. And it says, it is understood that the labeling and advertising for the new animal drug will prescribe, recommend, or suggest its use only under the conditions stated in the labeling, which is part of this application. So what they're telling you is you can't promote your product in an off-label manner. And that's why it's important to define that labeling up front so you know what you're shooting for and know what you're going to have at the end of the process. So effectiveness, where are you going to deal with that? You're going to look at pilot work, if there's any around, or if you can do pilot work, if there's some type of modeling work that you can do. You'll look to the literature, if there's anything that would be available. You will have to provide CVM, and you'll have to provide this in Europe as well, with some type of dose justification. You will have to explain to them why the dose you are picking is the appropriate dose for this new animal drug that you're proposing to go forward to approval. Okay? The U.S. is a little less critical of dose justification than Europe is. Europe is really looking for a very defined dose confirmation type approach, as opposed to the U.S., which is a little more leeway, looking for just dose justification. The pivotal study you're going to run is this clinical field study. You have to support the label being sought. You have to follow good clinical practice, which is another guideline that's out there, one that was developed through VICH. You will have to test the final formulation. It's foolhardy not to do that. And what you have to have at the end of the day is a clinically relevant, statistically significant result that you agree to with CVM during that protocol review and concurrence as to what's going to say whether or not the product worked or didn't work. And by the way, part of that review of your protocol is going to include all the statistics that you're going to do and how you're going to assess the results that you got. The environmental assessment. You have to do an environmental assessment for every product that's going to be on the market. However, there are some categorical exclusions that are allowed by CVM. Now, environmental assessment is sort of a very interesting story how this unfolded. NEPA, which is the environmental assessment, the work under NEPA, which is your National Environmental Policy Act, requires government agencies, not just FDA or CVM, but all other government agencies to assess what the impact is of any major action that they take. Now, an approval of a new animal drug for CVM is a major action. So therefore, an environmental assessment has to be made. For years, CVM went through this process of requiring data and data and data to assess the environmental assessment of new animal drugs. They really were grasping when they first started implementing this. They didn't know what to ask for. Eventually, over time, and really through probably the efforts of one industry representative, they finally backed down and said, you know, you're right. We're putting these products into biologic systems. They're not hitting the environment until they hit until it's already been processed by a biologic system. So there's probably some ways we can loosen this burden. And what they've done that you can apply now for a waiver and get a categorical exclusion for the need to provide an environmental assessment. And this is what I have here, the 2533, which says you can get an exclusion if it's marketed under the same conditions of approval, and that is code word for meaning a generic product, if it is intended for non-food animals, which opens up the whole companion animal area to you. So that's the good news. If it's a minor species, if it was approved for a major species in the past, if it's used under prescription or under a veterinarian's order. A prescription veterinary drug is really a drug that's restricted for use by or on the order of a licensed veterinarian. Okay, therefore it's a restricted product. But if you are going to sell the product as a prescription, only sold to licensed veterinarians, you're excluded from the need for an environmental assessment there either, or actions under the INAD, which is an investigational new animal drug application, which is where what you open to do all your research work. So what you're looking at in environmental assessment is the probability is high to get an exclusion in the US. In Europe, you need to give them an environmental assessment, but you can usually stop at the first tier on environmental assessments for Europe if it's a companion animal product. And you can get a pass, you do that assessment, and then you can cut it off right there. So by and large, for a companion animal product that's going to be prescription, you aren't going to need that environmental assessment, which is a big piece. If you are an over-the-counter product for a food animal product, for example, you're looking at probably $1 million worth of work. Okay, so this is a big break not to have to give an environmental assessment. So then, wrapping it up, if we looked at the summary of what I've tried to convey to you, the key factors are safety, efficacy, and quality in production. In the U.S., a sterilant or a contraceptive is going to be a new animal drug as defined by the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. In the EU, it's going to be a veterinary medicinal product. The core agencies that we deal with in the U.S., it's going to be the Food and Drug Administration, and then our particular center that we deal with for veterinary products is the Center for Veterinary Medicine. For the EU, it's the European Medicines Agency, and their technical group, which is the CVMP, Committee for Veterinary Medicinal Products. The data requirements are pretty much similar around the world, but no matter how you cut it, it's an expensive, it's a time-consuming process to get these products approved, and it is clearly a significant investment in time and money for the sponsor that's trying to get the product approved. And that's it. Thank you very much for your attention. So we still have time if anybody has any questions or isn't clear on anything I spoke about. Here's a question.
Hi.
Hi.
So I've got a couple questions. I'll yield the floor if more people are brave enough to stand up. So Superlorin has been commercially available in Europe for 15 years and is only allowed to be administered to ferrets in the US marketed under Superlorant F. So why can't there be an expedited regulatory step for a drug like this?
Well, first, there's no reciprocity between the U.S. and Europe. Could you repeat the question, please? Oh, sure. That was a question. Why couldn't there be an expedited process for a product like Suprelorin, who's been on the market in Europe for many years, while it's not been on the market in the U.S. for dogs or cats, only for ferrets? There is no reciprocity between Europe and U.S. So the process in the U.S. has to go through the same steps as they would for any new chemical entity. And the sponsors of Suprelorin have not gotten CVM to the point of agreeing that their product is safe and effective and made in a quality way, otherwise it would be approved. There isn't really an expedited process that CVM has. CVM at one point had what they called rapid review. That doesn't really exist anymore. And it would be up to the holder of the product to go to CVM and either try and negotiate something to make it move more quickly, or provide the data that's lacking, at least in CVM's eyes, until they would get the product approved in the U.S.
So using this specific example that I gave with Suprelorin, much of the regulatory steps that you've mentioned have already been demonstrated with the Superlorant F, which is already approved. The efficacy and safety in dogs and cats has already been, the data and the statistics that you say are necessary have already been done. I know you said there's no reciprocity between the two continents, but the data is the data. It's not going to change depending on where that research was done or the validity of the science. So again, I'm asking what the holdup is.
David, maybe I could take this, because years ago I was the regulatory consultant for Suprelorin, both for EU and the US. So I was doing the negotiating with the FDA about possible approval when it was a peptide drug. And actually they did not accept the efficacy data that had been generated. They wanted a different endpoint, they wanted a different length of study, they wanted a different study design. So it really is up to the regulators to negotiate with VRBAC on what data they feel are acceptable. And I think the example that David used about thalidomide is a good example. So back in, what was it, the 60s, thalidomide was approved in Europe for use in pregnant women that were nauseous, and it was considered safe and effective by the Europeans. And it wasn't until kids started getting born with no legs and arms that people realized it wasn't safe. And the FDA had a reviewer who had said she had looked at the data and felt that it wasn't approvable. And it's kind of set a precedent and a feeling amongst the regulators that everybody gets to choose their own endpoints and their own ways of regulating. And so when I was talking to the folks at the FDA, we had all those data that you talk about, and they looked at it and said it's not sufficient for us. So I know it's hard to understand because it seems pretty straightforward. If it's been used for years and there's no problems and it works and it's useful, why can't the FDA do it? But that's just not how they work. So the other thing is the manufacturing criteria. From how it's being manufactured is slightly different in the US and in Europe, and that would have to be rationalized as well. So there's a considerable amount of data work that would have to be done to satisfy the FDA requirements.
Okay, Linda, don't go anywhere. So Superlorant F is available and made in the United States. It's exactly the same drug, exactly the
It's
same
not made
implant.
in the US. It's not made in the US.
Oh, so then why is that okay to be?
It's not approved. It's indexed. So it's actually made available to people to use specifically for ferrets through
and it's mums.
well, yes, and it goes through a different group. So, but it actually says right on the Suprelorin F, not approved by the FDA. And the reason they did that is because they didn't feel there were enough data but they were wanting to make it available for ferrets because they had no alternatives, and they had a different approval process. So in that very narrow, because it's a very small population, it's very narrow, they indexed it. And when I talked to the people at CVM, they said they like the indexing because if a problem arises, they can immediately pull it off the market, which they wouldn't do for a larger population for dogs. That's how they view it.
Okay, and then to follow up your point about it was originally brought up, 10 years ago through PepTech, and then since then it's been used on probably close to 500,000 animals worldwide, maybe more than that. Wouldn't there be a good opportunity to have the FDA review the data now that perhaps the endpoints have not only been reached but well surpassed?
VRBPAC will have to make the decision of whether or not they want to spend the money to get it approved here. It's really up to VRBPAC. But certainly when they speak to the FDA, they will probably bring all the pharmacovigilance data that was generated, the safety data, over all these dogs that were used. But unfortunately, it still doesn't make it any easier. They still have to do all the manufacturing technical section, as David suggested, and the FDA has different ways of looking at how a product is manufactured. So, I know it's frustrating. I'm not defending it that it's the right way or it's the best way, but we're just telling you this is how the FDA works.
No, I don't mean to make you feel on the defensive either. It seems for this audience, especially with those that hold animals to a certain degree of reverence, that to unnecessarily repeat studies that have to be finished by euthanizing animals so that the entire body of the animal can be studied for toxicity is unnecessary and unethical and inhumane. So there has to be some alternatives, and maybe it needs to be brought not just by this particular company, this pharmaceutical company, but from another group who is interested in the ethical and humane treatment of animals to bring about a product that not only speaks to the ethical and humane treatment of animals, but not to say that we are going to bring this product to our market by virtue of treating animals unethically and inhumanely.
Well, I would say that they may not have to do the standard 135X safety study, depending on how the FDA will look at the data. There are safety data available, and the safety data may be enough. They may not have to do another euthanasia study, but they certainly would have to do another efficacy study. And those are the kinds of discussions that VRBPAC would have, and they would bring the same kind of viewpoint as you have to that discussion. They would say we have all this pharmacovigilance data on real animals that have been used all over the world, where VRBPAC is required to collect adverse event information from all these animals, and they might be able to negotiate a different path with the CVM. So, and I would say from my experience, the CVM is very sympathetic to animal welfare concerns. They do not want to euthanize any more animals than are absolutely necessary to assure that pets will be kept safe. So I feel fairly confident that they would take a hard look at the data that are available and not just automatically say, well, here's your checklist, you have to do these things.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I do have another question unless someone else wants to ask a question.
I think you're good.
All right, so as a theriogenologist, I certainly appreciate the comment that pregnancy is not a disease, but there are disorders that occur with a higher prevalence to dogs after their gonads have been removed. Urinary incontinence is one that probably most people in this room would agree to. GnRH as either immunization or as an agonist treated in order to downregulate LH levels would be a product that could be used to treat a disease. And so I'm wondering if this would be my main application for these products, and that's why I'm so frustrated that the GnRH vaccine that we had available through Pfizer when Zoetis purchased the company was pulled off the market after it had been FDA approved, and there's no thoughts to bring anything like that to the market. I just came back from the AVMA conference last week, talked with all the main veterinary biologic companies asking, why don't we have, why doesn't anybody have a horse in this game? And at least the manufacturers, representatives that were on the floor were just really unaware of these problems. And I don't know whether that's because they're intentionally unaware or unintentionally unaware. So there are, I just wanted you to know or be aware that there are diseases, disorders, conditions that are treatable with these products, not necessarily pregnancy.
Well, what I think, if you had a product like that you wanted to use for urinary incontinence, it would still have to go to a discussion between FDA and USDA. Sure. They would make a decision as who was going to regulate it, and it still may come down to FDA because there's not a disease organism involved, and maybe I wasn't real clear, but when they're talking diseases, they're talking about usually organism-regulated diseases, and I don't think you would see incontinence necessarily related to a particular bacteria or something else that you could tie it to. So that might be a hurdle. If you wanted to go to USDA, you could certainly talk to them and ask if they would regulate it. And as I said, it might be a better path forward, but there's no guarantee that they'd take it.
Thank you.
Can I just comment on that?
Yeah, please.
Hi, my name is Graham. So I was the fellow that registered the benign prostatic hyperplasia vaccine, which is a GnRH-based vaccine. So I guess the point is, going back to your label thing, is one, there is the capability of developing that kind of a product. It's been done before. I registered it, and then Pfizer, when they bought our company, deep sixed it. Just I wanted to follow up on your label thing. So if you think about vaccines and you think about label, in my mind, if there's a way to divide going down the Food and Drug path versus the USDA path by your label, then I would recommend you definitely try to go down the USDA path. Costs a lot less and a lot less
costs
time.
a lot less.
Something occurred to me in listening to Linda's description of her experience with FDA, and I think she said about 10 years ago. And I have to wonder, based on comments other people have made to me over the years, how much FDA's or the current staffing at FDA might change interpretation or application of the regulations. What I'm getting at is, if something was turned down 10 years ago, would those regulations or interpretation of that regulation still be as stringent today? Or do ideas, morph over time given, the people who are at FDA now versus 10 years ago?
10 years ago, the record's still going to be there. So every decision that CVM made is going to be carried out in a form that the current regulators can see what their predecessors did. And probably over a period of 10 years, what you've got is reviewers that are now moved up to team leaders or who are division leaders. So having that change isn't necessarily something that can happen. If you have a change in the science, and you can go to them and say, here, look at this new aspect of the science. It's different than what we thought 10 years ago. You might have a way forward. But what you've also had in CVM over the past 10 years is it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And there's a lot more reviewers than there used to be, and a lot more administrative staff than there used to be, and a lot more policy people than there used to be. I don't know that you're necessarily going to get a lightening of requirements. You might get more requirements added because there's more people with varied scientific backgrounds that are thinking differently about products than they may have been 10 years ago.
So Joyce Briggs with ACC&D, and I'm reminded that when people do ask questions, please state who you are, so we'll have that for the record. But my question, you talked about the challenges of a product with duration, getting in them knowing how long or how to look at the efficacy data and duration data. So if we're looking for things that are permanent, what might be the the scenario of what they would design for how to look at something that's designed to have a label claim as permanent? And we guess we have one example with Zutrin having FDA approval as to what they did in that situation.
And I think the question, it's really very product specific, and I think that's exactly what CVM would tell you. And I'll give you my standard answer as a lawyer that I learned first year in law school. When someone asks you a question like that, you always say, it depends. And it really is true with what they would do. You as the sponsor would go into them and have this plan of what you think would be appropriate. Now, maybe you can show them by different means that you've got a permanent sterilant because of what happens to the tissue, let's say in situ, what happens to the testicle. You can show them histologically what maybe happens over a very short period of time. If you have a sterilant, however, that you want to have dosed multiple times, say in the animal's lifetime, like suprelorin, they could come back to you and say, well, one dose really isn't enough in the field. We need to see 2 doses, and then we need to see what happens at the end of that second dose so we can be sure that the animal either comes off of it and everything is fine, or if there's any long-lasting effects. So it really depends on what you think the product is going to do, which kind of gets back to what are you claiming on the label as to how you then define that program. And like I said, that's one of the benefits you have at CVM. You can talk all these things through at a protocol stage. You can get scientific advice in the EU where you go and you pay money to have this conversation with CVM not with CVM, with EMA and CVMP on what's a reasonable scientific approach for something. But that's more the exception than the rule. At CVM, at least you have this opportunity to have these discussions over all your pivotal studies. So I don't really have an answer for you, Joyce. It could be long, could be short, depending upon what the biology is of the product that you're trying to get approved. Any other questions? If not, well, thanks again, and I guess enjoy the evening.